There is a lot of noise generated online about which cameras have the better color science. Now, whether that's a Canon camera or a Sony camera. Also, people discuss whether software such as Lightroom has better or worse color than Capture One. Now, there is no color science to this. All of the manufacturers are just choosing different colors, flavors of color. And so if you really want to get into the science of creating accurate color, which I believe should be the pursuit of most people who are very fussy about color, then you create your own profile for your specific camera. Not all cameras will have the same colors, even if they're branded with the same model number. Here I'm going to show you the Alpha 6700. Now, most people will either be using Adobe's default profile, Adobe Color, or one of the camera profiles. These are picked up from the Sony cameras, camera neutral or standard. You'll see from here I'm actually using a custom profile called the Alpha 6700 Dual Illuminant. So if I come back to the grid view, you can see I've got this color passport or color checker. Now, it was branded by X-Rite, and now I've seen it branded under the name Calibrate. So if you're wanting to get accurate color, you might choose to invest in one of these products. So what I've done is I've photographed this product in two different color temperatures. The first one is sunlight. Now, a lot of photographers then record a second shot using tungsten light, but given that I very rarely photograph in tungsten light, my second shot was photographed in shade, still with skylight but without sunlight. So if I then come to these two different shots in different color temperatures, I select both of them. I then right click and come down to export. Now, after installing the software that accompanies this product, I can now go to color checker camera calibration, and then I'll give a name for this one, obviously the camera name. I will need to calibrate every camera that I own, so I'm going to go Alpha 6700 Dual Illuminant, and then I'll give it a year as well to 2024, and then I can click save. Now what will happen is the accompanying software will generate a profile. Now Lightroom won't be able to see this profile until I've restarted the software, so you will get a little notification from the color checker camera calibration that it has generated the new profile, but you will need to restart the software. So I've already created this dual illuminant profile before, and so I won't need to restart the software, but I'll show you where to find this. Okay, so if you're working with a particular camera, you'll then just come over to the profiles, and then you'll see the profiles that you've actually created, custom profiles. This is the profile that has just been created with this demonstration. So here I've got my Alpha 6700 Dual Illuminant profile. There's the camera matching profiles from the Sony cameras, and here's the Adobe profiles. Adobe Color is the newest one, and Adobe Standard, which was the older one. As you can see, as you cycle around this, we get different color flavors, and the most accurate one will, of course, be the profile that I've created. Now it gets the hues pretty much 100% on target. Some of the color saturation values are a little bit high, so you might want to go and then desaturate some of the individual colors. And where you would do this is in the develop module. I'll just close this profile panel. You would come over to the color mixer, come over to your saturations, and you might want to maybe drop some of the colors that you think are just a little bit oversaturated. I found that sometimes the reds and oranges are just a little bit warm for my liking. And then I would come over and I would create a user preset for this. You can actually also integrate this into a develop default. So all images coming from this particular camera, all images being imported into Lightroom, will automatically have this custom profile applied and any other changes that you want to be applied from the start. Let's take a look at how I can edit this super high contrast image that I captured in Bali on the beach of Sanur. Now, if we take a look over to the basic panel here, you'll see that I've got my own custom profile which is the A6700 dual illuminant profile, which I created using an X-Rite color passport. This workflow is outlined in my color management seminar. Now, if you click on these four little oblongs here, you will be able to access all of the profiles that you can choose from. Now, we have Adobe's profiles, which is, Adobe Color. We've got Adobe Landscape. Just notice how when I move my mouse cursor over these, the preview changes. So we've got neutral, portrait, standard, and vivid. So we've got a number of different starting points offered by different choices of Adobe profiles. But we've also got the camera matching profiles. This matches the options that are available in the color styles, color look menu here. So we've got FL, IN, NT, PT, SH, ST, and then we've got that vivid one. So again, we've got a number of different starting points. So if you're not happy with the starting point that you have presented to you, you can choose another profile. So I'll close the profile because I'm going to stick with my dual illuminant. This does ensure that I've got very accurate hues. Now, the color passport does lead to some slightly oversaturated colors. So what you'll see in the color mixer panel is in the saturation, you'll see the reds and oranges are taken slightly down because the color passport does present very accurate hues, but sometimes the saturation values are a little bit high. So again, I'll close that. Now you'll notice in the basic panel, all of these sliders are not at the 0 settings. Even when I hit reset, they're basically starting with my preferences. Now the way I created these personal preferences as a starting point was first to create a preset, a user preset, which I put in a folder called camera profiles here, or camera presets, and I've created one for the Alpha 6700 here. Now the reason that these don't default to 0 when clicking on reset is I've taken another step further, which is to come into Lightroom preferences here, come down to presets, and you'll see that for my Alpha 6700 camera, I can come down here, come to preset, choose camera, come down to the 6700 preset that I created and make that as the default starting point. So any images being imported into Lightroom from this particular camera model will start with my defaults rather than Adobe's defaults. And one of the things you will see in this preference for starting with my own defaults, I'll just collapse that one, is I am starting with shadows raised higher and highlights lowered. Now, the shadows raising higher is very important to me because I do leave D-range optimizer on in the camera. This automatically lightens the shadows on the monitor and in the finder and is applied to JPEGs but not applied to RAW files. So I actually prefer to match what I was seeing in camera by raising that shadows value to at least plus 50. Now in this particular instance, I don't think the shadows are light enough. So I'm going to push this perhaps all of the way so we get good detail. Now, if I don't need a plus 100, I could back that up slightly to maybe plus 90 or so, but I do want to see good detail in here. And I might even lower the highlight values so I get more information in those brightest of highlights. Now, when I do aggressively lower the highlights and raise the shadows, I will automatically raise the contrast. Otherwise, the images can look a little bit flat. I'm also going to raise the exposure value a little bit more, maybe up to 2/3 of a stop there. And then we've got a little bit of black clipping in the ropes trailing in front of that beach. So I might deal that by raising that black's value up to 0. And I'm also going to raise the vibrance up a little bit more, maybe to plus 30. Now, one of the first things I'm going to do with this after just fine-tuning those settings from my starting defaults is to come into the crop overlay here. Now, I notice that this is slightly crooked, so I'm going to click on this angle tool here. I'm going to click on the horizon line on the left and then move that over to the horizon line on the right, and you'll see that it was basically 1/3 of a degree crooked. I'm a little bit fussy on this, and I often can't get that absolutely straight during capture, so I will rely on straightening it in post-production editing. I might also come into that crop and choose a different aspect ratio or shape. Now, you know I'm a fan of the 16:9 aspect ratio because this fills a monitor or TV screen which also shares that 16:9. Now you'll see I'm putting the horizon line right in the middle of the frame here. I can change that crop overlay by pressing the O key to absolutely make sure that that is absolutely in the center like so now. So now I'm happy with the crop. I'm going to come out of that crop overlay. I notice the sky is just a little bit bright at the top, so I am going to come into the masking options there. Now, part of my default settings is I will put a mask at the bottom and also at the top of the image. I do like to darken the image at the base and at the top, but because we've cropped that, that's slightly out of view now, so I'm bringing that back into view. Now with the one at the top, I am going to come into the color, and I'm going to add a little bit of blue to make just a little bit of a richer blue in there, and I'm going to drag that a little bit lower as well. With the one at the base, I am happy with the darkening that's happening, -1/2 a stop, but I don't want the blacks to be clipped in this foreground rope, so I'm going to raise that blacks point to +5. And you can see in the clipping warnings here now, we've got no shadow or highlight clipping, except for the colors around the sun. Now you see that triangle in the highlight clipping is red, not white, and that's basically we're just clipping in one of the color channels because of a very saturated color, but again we've got full detail except for the surface of the sun, which is generally something we don't want to see detail on. And now that is pretty much my finished high contrast edit for this particular image. Okay, so let's come back to grid view. There are some instances where the contrast of the landscape we're capturing, especially when we're pointing the camera towards the sun, can be a little bit extreme, i.e. too high for the dynamic range of the sensor. Now, if we take a look at these 3 shots, I actually created a bracket shots of 3 different exposures here. So let's just come into these in the develop module and take a look at the information overlay, and we can see that I'm shooting at f16 for maximum depth of field, 15 seconds, and you'll see 4 seconds. So we're bracketing around shutter speed, not aperture. I don't want to have differences in aperture value and depth of field value here, and again differences in exposure now, all to do with exposure around shutter speed. So what I'm going to do is these 3 bracketed shots, I am going to right click and choose photo merge HDR, which stands for high dynamic range. Now it's creating a HDR preview. Now, if you've captured these handheld, which some people may well want to do, you will need to auto align the images, so you want to check that. If you think you might have bumped the tripod, that's also a good option to check as well. Auto settings, this will allow you to get the best possible post-production. Now it will only be a starting point, so you will need to fine-tune that, but it does speed up the HDR process if we check that box. Now I'm also going to choose to de-ghost this image. This is especially important if you've got subject matter that is moving in between each of the individual exposures. Now in this instance the rocks aren't moving and the camera's on a tripod, but the clouds are moving. So if I click none, you might see some artifacts here around the moving clouds in the center of the image. So if we click low, we might get an improvement there. So we've got to rebuild the preview, so that might take a few seconds. Again, we're getting a little bit of patchiness in the foreground water. So again, if we move over to medium, we get to the patch or lines or edges here are even worse. So I'm going to have to go right up to the high value to get smooth areas of tone and color, both in the sky and also in the foreground water there. So now with the all of those options, auto align, auto settings, and deghosting, we are going to merge these three exposures. Now, as I said, it might take a little bit of a while, and we are going to need to fine tune these settings once we've done that. So it's just completing that now. I'm just looking for that HDR image that we've just created, and it's pretty much, well, this is the one that I've created. This is one that I created earlier. So let's just open up this image and take a look in the develop module of this particular image. Now we're getting a little bit of black clipping here in the rocks. So the auto settings have put quite an aggressive negative value on that blacks. So I'm just going to wind that back until we don't have any clipping in the blacks here. Now I'm going to create a little bit of extra contrast, I think, is required to create sort of a more natural feel. Sometimes auto or HDR images can look a little bit artificial because they lack contrast, which is strange given that what we're doing this HDR for is because there was too much contrast. So sometimes you might need to wind in a little bit more contrast. The sky is a little bit bright compared to the foreground water, so I'm going to come into the masks module here. I'm going to select that sky using that AI tool and then just wind the exposure back a little bit so we got a better tonal match between the foreground water and the sky here. I'm also going to come in with one additional mask, which is a linear gradient, and I'm just going to wind that down over the top third of the image and again create some more negative exposure. I'm also going to add a little bit of clarity just to put a little bit of pop into those clouds and also a little bit of extra saturation. And I think this image is pretty much done. So there is a HDR photo merge using three separate exposures. Now you'll access those exposure bracketing by going to the drive mode settings in your camera. If we take a look at the basic panel in this particular image, you can see all of the sliders except for the white balance are set to 0. The as shot for the white balance is what the camera decided was the appropriate auto white balance for this shot, and I'm reasonably happy with this. But of course I don't use Adobe's default for the sliders here. I've overridden this default with my own personal develop default, and I've explained that elsewhere in this video. So if I hit the reset, we won't zero the sliders, we'll come back to my defaults, and you can see already the images are looking a lot closer to how I want the final image to appear, and that's because I prefer these settings as my default because they do get a lot closer. Now you can see that if we take a look at the detail panel, I've also raised the sharpening from the default value of 40 up to a higher value of 75, and I've also raised the masking slider to plus 80. So let's take a look at what else I would do to this particular image. First off, I want to optimize the aspect ratio or shape of the image so it fits a 16:9 aspect ratio screen. So we'll go into the crop and then we'll come from the original down to the 16:9 aspect ratio, and I can just fine tune that if required. Okay, so I'll commit that crop, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some linear gradients into this file. I want the tonality to fade off or become darker towards the base and towards the top. So I could do this manually, but I also use some presets. So if you have a look at these one-shot wonders, which I share, we've got a couple of the presets that I could actually use, such as graduated filters ×3. If I just click on that, it automatically applies 3 graduated filters, 2 to the top and 1 to the bottom. If I go over to the masking, you'll see these graduated filters here. I could adjust them if necessary. For instance, if I want to make that lower one, mask 3, a little bit darker, I could just move from -5, half a stop exposure, down to maybe 2/3 of a stop or nearly 1 stop. That masking slider is a little bit low in that it comes down over the top of the kookaburra, so I could raise that. Alternatively, I could click on this and hit subtract and select the subject to subtract that from that mask. So that will brighten up the top of that kookaburra now. Now you'll see that we've got some clipping warnings here. So we've got a little bit of clipping in those highlights, which I might want to edit as well. So we'll come out of that masking panel, come back into the basics and just lower the highlights a little bit more and maybe the whites down a little bit so we don't have any clipping in those brightest highlight tones there. One of the other things, so we can draw more attention to this particular kookaburra, is to darken the background. So again, I'll come into that masking panel, I'll create new mask, select background this time, and this time I'll lower the exposure by minus half a stop. So now the attention becomes fair and squarely on the kookaburra. We could add a radial gradient, that's a Shift M in Lightroom Classic, and just put a little radial gradient over that eye, and maybe just to make the eye pop a little bit, I could add a little bit of exposure, maybe just take the blacks down a little bit so we've got a nice black iris in the pupil there, and also add a little bit of clarity. Okay, so that makes the eye pop a little bit more. I'm pretty much done with that. So you can see the default settings were pretty much spot on. Well, my defaults rather than Adobe's defaults. And so that image is ready to go now. Let's take a look at this portrait edit. We'll come over into the basic panel. I'll just click reset at the bottom of the window here, just to make sure we are starting from my develop default settings, which is not the same as Adobe's develop default settings, I have to say. I typically lower the highlights, raise the shadows, add a little bit of contrast, exposure, raise the whites, lower the blacks, and add a little bit of vibrance. I've also added a little bit more sharpness in the detail panel, as you can see here, and raise the masking slider. Other differences that you'll encounter if you're working with Adobe's default also is the profile. You might be using Adobe Color or one of the camera profiles. In this instance, though, I've created my own custom profile for this Alpha 7C2, and I've incorporated that into the default for this specific camera. Now, you're seeing that the camera is using the as shot, which is the auto white balance of the camera, and it hasn't done a particularly good job in this instance. So I'm just going to click on that setting and choose daylight. It's a little bit on the green side, so I'm just going to raise the tint slider up to a higher value. Now, I have confidence in the colors that I'm looking at on my monitor because I've used a color calibration device to create a custom profile. So let's come over to the crop overlay tool. I'm just going to straighten this image. I just think it's a little bit crooked, so I'm just going to straighten that. I'm not going to crop it into the 16:9 aspect ratio in this instance because we've got a little bit of a tight composition. So I'm just going to apply that crop now. The image looks nice and straight now. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to come into the masking and I'm going to select a background. Now you'll also see part of the develop default for the Alpha 7C2 is I do have masks at the lower edge. I just like to darken off that lower edge slightly, and also the upper edge, as you can see there. So those have been wound into my own personal develop default. I'll click on the create new mask and select background, and I'm just going to lower the background brightness by half a stop or so. This will make the portrait character pop because the background is now just a little bit darker. It also ensures that that sky in the background is not clipping or overexposing. Now I'll click on the create new mask again, because if we come down to select people, it will detect any people within the frame. Obviously there's only one person in this frame, so it's neatly selected that one. Now we can select the entire person, which is the same as selecting subject, but we can also separate this out to selecting facial skin, eyebrows, eye, iris, lips, teeth, facial hair, and even the clothes. So we can edit this separately if we like. So for instance, if I was just looking at the facial skin, I could then create a mask, and then we've got that mask there. I'll just click off that show overlay. So what we could do now, for instance, is maybe just remove some of the texture just to improve the smoothness of the skin. Not so important with character portraits, but if you're trying to flatter a subject, you perhaps would come down and lower this texture slider. One of the other things that you could actually do with this is just brighten up the eyes slightly because the light is falling mainly from the skylight. We've got a slightly deeper shadow in the eyes. Now I could do this manually just by create new mask, select the brush, and then just come in with the brush tool. I'll just decrease the size of that brush and then just brush over the shaded side of the eyes. So more than just the whites of the eyes and the pupils, is I'm going down now over all of that shadow areas, and I'll raise that by half a stop. Just so that it's sort of an even tone with the rest of the face. I also notice the area around the mouth is also a little bit shaded. Basically everything above the cheekbones is quite bright. There's no peak to this headdress, so we've got a nice bright forehead. But what I'll do now is I'll just hold down the Shift key and press the M key on the keyboard in Classic and just create a radial gradient there, and maybe just brighten that area up again just to even all of the exposure, maybe just half a stop or so. That is a very quick edit, as you can see, but it just shows you the sort of things I'm looking for when editing a portrait. This is an image that I captured in India at the beginning of 2023. Now I'm using the FE20 70mm f4G. Now I'm using it at the 70mm focal length, so I get a nice tight composition on this woman. And I'm also getting the maximum shallow depth of field using the maximum f4 aperture. Because it's only an f4 lens, not a 2.8 or a 1.8 lens, the ISO has climbed to a value of 5,000. Now, when we're looking at the fit-in view, it's not completely apparent that there is a lot of noise in this image, but if I zoom in, you'll probably therefore see the noise. Now, it's not too much to be alarmed of, because remember, people on social media generally don't get the option to zoom in to see that noise. So you shouldn't be overly concerned about noise, especially if you're looking at that fit-in view. But of course, if you're going to be displaying on a very large 4K monitor or maybe an 8K monitor or printing to very large proportions, that noise might become apparent to the viewer. So really, Lightroom has got us covered in recent versions, because now we do have that AI denoise feature. So we would access that by coming to the detail panel, and we can see in the noise reduction we can click denoise here. Now it's going to load the enhanced data. And a good starting point is perhaps the default in this dialog, which is that 50% value here. It is going to take a varying amount of time depending on your processor speed and the RAM, etc. Some people might do this denoise in less than 30 seconds. People with slower computers might take minutes, tens of minutes even, for very slow computers. So this is going to be largely dependent on your processing speed and how new your computer is. I'm just going to cancel that out because I prepared one earlier. So we'll go into grid view. I'm going to select both of these, and I'm going to come and do a side-by-side comparison here, and we're going to zoom in. Now I'll check that the lock symbol is locked, so that when we do zoom in, as you can see, we're going to zoom both to 100%. Now the one on the left obviously is before denoise, and the one on the right is post denoise. So you can see even at ISO 5000 we're getting a really clean image, devoid of any noise pretty much whatsoever. So this is a huge new AI feature, and it's been around for a little while now, but never underestimate this. Some people are a bit nervous about maybe choosing APS-C cameras because they're usually a stop behind in both dynamic range and high ISO noise performance. But in terms of high ISO noise performance, it's pretty much a level playing field now that we do have these denoise post-production features for raw images. Now it's raw only in Lightroom at the moment, but we can actually denoise images in Topaz Photo AI if you're a JPEG shooter. So you can do this with other options. You'll see this is also available in DxO software as well, and there's quite a few choices now, but I'm using Lightroom, and this is pretty much a good view here now. So let's return to grid view. I can click on that icon in the extreme lower left hand corner there, or press the G key on the keyboard. Now you can see that I've got the original file here. Now the one that's had the denoise applied has the enhanced NR for noise reduction in the name of the new file, and it's still a raw file. So let's just click on that file. I'll just click off that one just to deselect it. So we'll take that into the develop module now. Okay, so we have that clean, noise-free image, but what I'm now going to do is address maybe the depth of field in this image. Now we are using an f4 aperture lens. Now I could have tried to defocus that more by switching maybe to a portrait prime, such as the 85mm 1.8 or 90mm Sigma f2.8, but in this instance I was using an f4 lens, and I do want a little bit more separation between the subject and the background. Now, one of the new features of Lightroom is this lens blur. It has been in an early access feature for a while now, but that notification has been removed because this is the finished version, the fine-tuned version of this feature. Now we are going to need to click on that little checkbox, which is apply there, in order to create a mask for the subject and background. And it by default is going to apply a 50% amount of blur. We can see it before and after just by holding and clicking down on that eye icon, so we can see before and after. Now you might be happy with that 50%, but we can obviously increase that some more. We can fine-tune these options by just clicking on a variety of different apertures. These will only make a significant difference if you've got highlights, little bright highlights of maybe lights at twilight in the background, or maybe light passing through the leaves of trees, etc. We can also change the focus range. I can visualize the depth here about what is being blurred in this image. So you can see the yellow areas are the areas that are not being blurred, and we can see all of the areas in these magenta red colors are areas that are being blurred. And we can obviously increase that range, so pull a little bit more focus into that background if required. I'll just click off that visualize depth because I'm really quite happy with that default. So that becomes my new optimum image, and it looks like now I've been capturing this with an f2.8 lens instead of an f4 lens, so I'm really happy with that outcome. So let's go back to grid view and take a look at some other images that I've been applying this lens blur feature to. So in this particular image, if I come to the develop module, I've ramped up the blur amount to 100 here, and you can see that I've also can fine-tune that focus range. So I really just want a very narrow strip of this image that is actually using a focus point now. So if we again click on that visualize depth, you can see where the focus actually is inside of this image. So if I wanted to, for instance, pull focus in the foreground, I could actually just grab that left handle there and pull that to the left. So I've now got focus from the foreground through to the figure looking at their smartphone, but quickly going out of focus. Now you can see I've got a little bit of a bright highlight here. This is where we can actually change the shape of those out of focus highlights. So for instance, if I go to that third one across, it looks like I've been using a lens with very few aperture blades. So that sort of hexagonal highlight there. I'm happy with the round apertures, which obviously Sony lenses pride themselves on, to get that smooth round highlight there. So again, another way of creating a shallower depth of field, even though I had stopped down originally to get that f8, so I did want deep depth of field at this 24mm focal length. So if I click on there, you can see that I did have overall depth of field, but it does allow me to change my mind in post-production editing. So this is a great new feature, having this control to basically decide how much depth of field you want in post-production. This could actually get even better if the camera manufacturers decided to put sort of depth control in or onto our cameras. Now the smartphones have them. They have those like LiDAR sensors on the front of the cameras to basically measure depth information as they're capturing the images. This allows those smartphones to create this shallow depth of field in post-production because the sensors are so small, basically everything is sharp, even with the wider apertures. But of course, this is quite good using the AI technologies because it usually can detect where the subject is using the AI technologies that we currently have. Let's go back to grid view and we'll take a look at another image. I probably overcooked it in this instance, to be honest, because I was more than happy with my f4 aperture on my 20-70mm lens in this instance. So you can see we've got that ramped up blur amount. I might just decrease that to the standard 50, and you can see at the f4 aperture we did have quite pronounced figure ground separation because I have got moved quite close to the subject matter, and I put the background further away from the subject matter simply by asking the person where to stand in the framing of this. But if you like an f2.8 aperture look or feel when using your f4G lenses, that is now possible. If we take a look at the edge, we've got quite good edge detection here, so there's no accidents, errors here along the edge. So let's take a look at an image which has been slightly less successful because this isn't always going to get it right. So I'll come to this image, and again we'll go into the develop module. This one is where it's not working out. We can see that we've ramped up the blur amount. I'll just show you a before and after. So it's already quite blurred, but when we're blurring this image, we're actually losing the raindrops by doing this post-production blur. And if we zoom in on the edges, you can see it's a little bit clunky, a little bit blocky here, because this wet hair is very difficult for the subject recognition to work out where to draw the mask. And so in this particular instance, I wouldn't actually apply the post-production blur on this image. I would just be happy that using this 1.4 aperture lens is blur enough. There is sometimes the opportunity to get too much background blur. Let's take a look at another couple of examples where I might decide to use lens blur in post-production. So if we take a look at this image that I captured of this woman in Melbourne's central business district, you can see that she's leaning up against the wall, and I sometimes don't like regular geometric patterns behind the portraits that I capture. One of the ways that I can combat that, of course, is to change my own angle of view. So when I was taking this particular portrait, I moved in a little bit closer, but also came in at a slight angle. This meant that the background behind her was further away, so I increased the amount of background blur. Now, if we take a look at the information with this one, you can see also I'm working with an f4 aperture lens. Now, again, if I choose the maximum focal length, I'm going to get the maximum amount of blur in this particular instance. But let's go back to the previous shot where I've photographed her head on, where the patterns of the brick is mostly in sharp focus. So we'll take that into the develop module and again go into the apply background blur, and you'll see that if we ramp that up perhaps to 80 or so, we're going to lose that focus on those bricks, creating more what I call figure ground separation. Because we don't have much flyaway hair on the edges, you'll see the small amount of soft edges here around here has been handled quite well. It only becomes slightly problematic when we've got the hair moving over that top of the ear. So if I just hold down the eye icon, you can see, yes, we've lost that fine detail. So you sort of have to be aware of when this feature is going to meet its match. It's not going to perform as well as it should. You might not notice that, but if you are looking for areas where it might make mistakes, it is in those areas. Okay, let's come back into grid view. One of the, or two of the images there where it's been quite successful, however, is this one where I'm working with a wide angle of view. As you increase to moving to a wider focal length lenses, the background is going to become in sharper focus. You can counteract that by moving closer to create narrower depth of field. But of course, you are going to have limited success when using a wide angle lenses. So this is where, again, lens blur might come into its own. So if I just hold down the icon, show you a before and after, we do have some figure ground separation because I am working quite close to my subject here. But if we don't want to be distracted by reading signs in the background, we can maybe resort to using the blur. We are going to have to be very careful with some of these edges. It is going to make mistakes. They may not be immediately apparent, but unless you've probably seen the before image. Again, going back to grid view. This is again using a 24mm focal length, and I have cropped in, making that background perhaps even more problematic to get figure ground separation. So this is one where I think it's worked out quite well, probably because we don't have lots of flyaway hair here. And if I click on the before and after, you'll see the interior of the shot was just in a little bit too much sharp focus, and maybe that figure in the background on the extreme left of the image would become a slight distraction. So just applying a little bit more background blur in post-production does allow you to focus your attention on the main character leaning on that doorway. Let's take a look at how I've created this composite image in Photoshop. We'll come back to grid view so you can see this sequence of 5 images I'm going to use. Now there were many more images in the final composite, but I'm just going to use 5 just to outline the workflow inside of Photoshop. So with the first image selected, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, click on the last image in the sequence, then right click and choose Edit In, and then Open as Layers in Photoshop. That's the bottom option there that we can see. Now it may take a while for Photoshop to open, but it's going to layer each of those individual images into the same file. Once that is complete, we're going to set about creating some layer masks. Now I'm just going to hold down the Command key on my Mac, that would be the Control key on a PC, and press the letter 0. This will magnify the image to fit in screen. So this will give you the best opportunity to look at the fine detail. Now we're going to click on this little panel here, which is new to Photoshop CC, and that is Select Subject. Now it won't always be absolutely accurate, but it does give us a starting point for the layer mask. I'm going to come over to my Layers panel and then click on the Add Layer Mask. We also have an option here in this little movable panel here where we can click to create a mask from the selection. Now what we're going to do is, you can see there's little bits of the subject here that are missing from view. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press the B key for brush. I'm going to select the foreground color as white. Now if you've got the defaults here, you can select the defaults by pressing the D key and then X to switch around the default foreground and background colors. Now I want white as the foreground color here, and now I'm just going to paint over that missing part of the golf club there, so that is in the layer mask. Okay, with that first layer mask successfully completed, we're going to click on the little eye icon to hide that layer. We're now going to click on the layer below, so that's the number 2 golf swing here, and do the same routine. Select subject, and now we're going to create a mask. Now you'll see that there's more of the golf club missing in this one, but we are going to proceed and just click on the create mask from selection. Now it's hard to imagine where that golf club is because it's completely missing from the layer mask. So one technique to more accurately be able to find that golf club is just to invert the layer mask temporarily. So with that layer mask selected, just do Command I on a Mac or Control I on a PC, which switches over that layer mask or inverts that layer mask. Now instead of revealing, we're actually going to hide this golf club because it is missing from that mask. So in order to hide that, we are going to have to press the X key. So we've got black as the foreground color, and you can increase or decrease the size of the brush using the square bracket keys. You've also got the options up here in order to create a size of the brush and also hardness. Now I've got a little bit of a soft edge on the brush, so we won't see the painting strokes. You can reduce that even further to something like 60 or 50% if you want quite a soft edge. Okay, so let's proceed to hide this golf club. So we just hide the head of that golf club and then come along the shaft of that golf club to hide all of that golf club from view. Once that is complete, we'll go back to that layer mask and do Command I or Control I on a PC to switch that through. Now you can see we've created an effective layer mask for that second layer. So again, we'll come over to the Layers panel, toggle that view off, so that is now hidden from view. Click on Golf number 3 layer, and we'll go through the same sequence. Select Subject, we're going to add the layer mask, and we're going to invert that layer mask, and then we'll hide this golf club from view. So again, with black as the foreground color, I'm just going to run along that golf club to hide that from view. Come back to the Layers panel, Command or Control I, and again, that layer is now complete. Toggle off the visibility, golf number 4, select Subject, and add the layer mask, and invert that layer mask, and then hide that golf club one more time. And now we can go back and invert that layer mask. And now we're pretty much finished this project, other than just switching those eye icons back on. Now that was the technique I used. I had a few more layers in the original image that I showed you, but that is the basic technique. If we want to save this back to Lightroom, we just do Command S on a Mac or Control S on a PC, and then come back to Lightroom, and we'll see that that image that we've just edited is here in view. And now we can export that as a JPEG for sharing with social media. So this is a great way of creating an action sequence from a number of images, perhaps captured with the high or high plus drive modes. One of the new features inside of Lightroom is in the Remove Tools section. Now we need to access this by clicking on the Generative AI. Now, as you're watching this movie, this feature is still in the early access mode, which means that it probably should get better, but it's already pretty good now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline some of the ways we can use this new Generative AI. Now, some people will be ethically opposed to using AI tools, but some others will just see it as a more refined way of using the clone stamp tool or the healing brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline how we can remove this hand from this particular shot. Now, I'm just going to control the size of the brush, so maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller, and then come over and then select the fingers, and also the out to the thumb there, the back of the hand. Now you see I'm not being very accurate at all here. I'm just selecting all of the area that I want to replace with background. Now you can see this is going to be a little bit of a challenging task for this tool, because obviously behind the hand are feathers. So let's see whether the AI tool can replace this. Now we are going to click on the apply button. It will take up to 30 seconds or longer, so and obviously these times will vary, but it's ripping through, and now it's obviously talking to the AI servers, probably back in Silicon Valley or somewhere, and it's going to give me 3 options that I can choose from for replacing this. So already you're probably going, wow, but we can actually cycle through these 3 options here. So this is option number 1, and this is option number 2, which I actually prefer. I think the feathers are probably just a little bit more pronounced there. And option number 3, again, we've got a little bit of the old hand appearing there. So I think option number 2 is the best one. We can refresh this. If we don't like any of the 3 options, we can refresh that. But you can probably see that this is a pretty astonishing tool. If I was to come out of this tool and then just zoom in, you're going to be hard pressed to work out where the AI tool has been. This is a fairly staggering advancement for Lightroom. As normally we don't do any pixel level editing. We can sort of move pixels, change pixel values, but we don't replace pixels with completely different values. And so this is quite a step forward for Lightroom to be able to do this. Now, one of the tools we can actually do inside of Photoshop is we can actually extend the canvas area. And I've done this in a previous seminar where I've got the complete wing on the right side in order to complete this. But now, if you're just looking to do a little bit of a repair job, remove various artifacts, then you can do this in Lightroom without having to go into Photoshop. Let's just go back into grid view and maybe look at another couple of examples of this. Okay, so this is another example that I used in the Generative Fill seminar, but again, this is something that we can now take on inside of Lightroom without going into Photoshop. So again, we'd click on that little remove tool and come over to these people who are walking into my shot, and this is sort of spoiling this composition somewhat. So just making sure that I've got all of that area selected, then clicking apply, letting generation or generative remove work its magic, and hopefully in one of the three options is going to be something that I can choose as my replacement that I need to fix this distraction on the right side. And already I'm more than happy with option 1, but I will cycle through the options looking, and again you can see the buildings are being replaced. Probably there's a little bit of a line on this one, so I preferred option 1, and option 3 is okay. I think I will go back to that option 1. Yep, and that will be my final edit there. Let's go back to the grid tool. This is again something that I use in the Generative Fill seminar, and we were doing this in Photoshop, not Lightroom, in that Generative Fill seminar, but as you can see, Generative Remove is very much aligned to this work that the Adobe software engineers have been working on. So again, we'll come back with that tool. I won't bother changing the brush size in this instance. I will just take out that distraction in the wall behind. Now, I wish I could have moved him further away from the wall so it was a little bit more out of focus, but it was a very narrow laneway, so I didn't have that option. So I'm choosing to remove it in post-production editing. So we'll click on apply, let the generative remove work its magic again. Now, I do know that there's going to be a problem here. So when you look at the final result, you'll see that line is almost certainly still going to be present in all three options. And I'm going to give you a clue as to why Generative Remove makes this error. And we're finally getting there. Some of you might get impatient, but there's an awful lot of communication between obviously Silicon Valley and me here in Australia going on, so 30 seconds is fast enough. And as you can see, all three options will still have that line present. So why has it made this error in this instance? So we'll just hit the reset, and I'll show you the problem is because I have cropped into this image, and as I remove the line from left to right, there's evidence of the line still out of that crop area there. And so Generative Remove is aware of that line, so it thinks that line should be continued. So the way around this is basically just to remove the crop. So let's just go and reset the crop. And you can see the reason I cropped this is because it's a little bit crooked. So now we'll go to the remove. We'll do that exercise one more time. So moving that line on the right side, removing that line on the left side, hitting the apply. Now I'm pretty confident this time because I've tried this many times, and the secret to success really is remove the crop, remove the distractions, especially that go towards the edges of the crop, and then crop as your last stage after removing any distractions. So again, we have to sit out that 30 seconds or so waiting for the generative remove to communicate with the AI servers, presumably in America somewhere, and then to give me those three options. And as you can see, again, probably all three options. There's probably not going to be too much to choose from. They're all pretty good options. So I'm going to come back in with the crop tool, and you'll see that I've got a crop overlay of this center area here, because this is very much a centralized composition. If you want to cycle through the different crop overlays, then just press the O key on your keyboard. There's the golden ratio, and we can see the crop aspect aspect ratios. We've got the grid we use for architecture. There's rule of thirds and a broader, wider grid. And there we've got that centralized center to horizontal and vertical lines there. So this allows me to center that nose in that composition so it's perfectly symmetrical, and then commit that crop. So again, the Generative Remove tool has come to my rescue there. And you're probably aware that that is very, very difficult just using previous tools. It would often struggle with getting things right up and over the edge of the ear. Let's go back to grid view. I'll take a look at one more. Again, I think I use this in the Generative Remove seminar for patrons, and I can just, this time I won't bother going through the process. You're probably familiar with that process. So I'll just go into the Develop module. I'll open up my panel because I've saved some snapshots of before and after. And you'll see the problem I'm dealing with is I really wanted this natural position of this woman in the foreground, but I really wanted to remove these two tourists visiting this temple. And so I used the Generative Remove tool just to remove this. You can see also there's a little bit of a modern table in this composition, and also over here. So I basically brushed over all of those and then clicked to remove and remove that modern table, remove the two tourists. I could have probably done some more work with this modern table, which has been elongated over here. But again, a very effective way of removing very complicated distractions from our images. I want to expand the canvas size or aspect ratio of this particular image from 3:2 to 16:9, but without losing the top or the bottom of the main. So this is really a job for Photoshop and Generative Expand. Now, the keyboard shortcut Command-E on a Mac or Control-E on a PC will bounce or open this into Photoshop. So I'll just exercise that keyboard shortcut, and then you'll see that this image opens inside of Photoshop. I'll just click out of that crop tool for the minute. Now I'm just going to do Command minus or Control minus on a PC just to zoom out a little bit, and then select the crop tool. Now you see I've already got the 16:9 aspect ratio selected here, but you'll come down to the 16:9 preset here. Now you can see that if I just did this with the existing image, we would actually crop into the bottom and top of the main. So what I want to do is expand this out so we retain the top and the bottom of the main, as we can see there. So now I've got that, and I could reposition or reframe this maybe over to the left slightly, and so the leading eye is in the center of the frame there. So once we've done that, I'm just going to hit the generate. Now you also see in the crop icon I've got Generative Expand. If I just wanted to keep the background tone, which is in the tools panel there, I could just change that to background default. But I'm going for the Generative Expand, click on the word generate, and we're not entering anything into the field. We're just basically going to let Photoshop try and work out what it needs to add to the left and right side, so that we're not basically letterboxing or putting blank spaces either side of this frame. It usually takes about 30 seconds for Photoshop to come up with 3 options that you can pick from. If you're not happy with any of those options, you are free just to run it again and again, looking for the perfect background that you're looking for. So we've got 3 options. You can see in this little floating tool panel here, I can move from option 1 to option 2 and option 3. So I'm more than happy actually with all 3 of these options. There's a slight difference in whether we're getting the rear end of the lion there. So maybe I'll go for this particular one in this instance. And once I'm happy with that one and I don't need this layer anymore, I can just collapse that. So that's Command-Shift-E on a Mac or Control-Shift-E on a PC, just to flatten that down into one flat background layer. I'm going to click on just the move tool there. This will give me options to select subject. So I'm just going to select the subject because I'm not entirely happy with some of the things that are appearing in the background. This lion was actually captured not in Africa but in a zoo. So we've got some obstructions here that I want to remove. So we're just going to select subject. Then I'm going to inverse this selection. So you can see a little icon in this floating panel here, which is invert selection. So I only have the background selected. I don't actually want this selected. I don't want the generative fill to sort of be filling anything in here. So I'm just going to select the lasso tool here, hold down the Option or Alt key and remove that from the selection so that Photoshop doesn't feel compelled to add something into that shadow there. Now I can hit Generative Fill to see what alternative backgrounds Photoshop can provide me with. So I'll hit Generative Fill and then Generate. And again, you could specify what it is you want to be in the background. You could maybe put African savanna or desertscape or something, just so you get a clearer idea of what it is you actually want in that background. I'm just going to let Photoshop basically create random backgrounds. They will almost certainly be out of focus or background. So now I'm not really happy with this option 1, so I'm looking for something that's a little bit plainer than this. So I think option 3 gives me the plainest background, just with a little bit of background bokeh. So that's the one I'm actually going to choose now. Again, I'll just flatten that image and then we'll hit save. So I'm using the Mac keyboard shortcut Command S, that would be Control S on a PC. So if I do that and we've saved that image, if I go back into Lightroom, you'll see that image has automatically been saved back into the folder where the original raw file is living, and then it basically loads as that image. So if we go back into grid view, you can see here is the original image and here is the edited image, and I've got that nice 16:9 aspect ratio. So if I just press the F key, you can see that we go full screen on this particular line, and that's really the final composition that I wanted for this line. This is an image that I've partially edited inside of Lightroom, but I'm going to complete the job inside of Photoshop. If we just go back to that Remove tool, I've actually run Generative AI in order to remove something that was distracting on the left side. So if I click on that little eye icon, you can see there was an outstretched hand, which obviously the bird is flying towards. So I've used the AI, Generative AI, to remove that, but I can't get the extreme right side of that wing, which I've clipped in camera. It's just a little bit of a tight composition for the 400mm lens that I was using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. Command E will basically force this to open up into Photoshop. So we're going to come to the crop tool, and I'm going to let's just collapse that panel, or these panels, so I can just stretch this out. Now you can see the ratio I've got to 16:9 because I do want the final version to fill the screen. So I think that should be enough for the tips of the wings to be completed by the generative fill. So now I will click Generate, and fingers crossed that it will basically get it first time round. As I said, there's always going to be a sort of a random nature to this, but each new iteration of Photoshop and the AI engines inside that Photoshop are running with in Silicon Valley, they're getting better with each passing month. So fingers crossed again. Let's take a look at what Generative Fill will basically provide for us. Okay, let's just collapse that panel so we can see the tips of the wings. Already version 1 looks great. I'll just cycle through just in case there's any deviations. Got a bit of a lighter tip of the feather in this version, and that one just slightly shorter. So they're all pretty good. We've got a little bit of a seam running down this version 3, which I don't care for. So in fact, the seam is there in version 2 as well. Yeah, that seam is on the log on version 3. So what I'll do is I'll select version 2, and I'm going to manually fix that now. We'll come back to the layers panel. So let's see if we can get rid of that seam. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select lasso tool and just lasso that area where I can see that straight line running down that area. It's probably important to select it all, because if it sees anything left from that line, it may just try and continue that. So with all of that selected, I'm going to select Generative Fill one more time and then hit Generate. Hopefully this will remove that little edge. Okay, let's move that panel out of the way, and you can see that very visible edge has basically been removed. I'll just cycle through all three options, and they've all pretty much done a good job there. Probably go for the option number 3. Now again, in the layers panel, we've got those two generative fills there, one generative expand, one generative fill. I'm going to collapse the whole thing down into a single background layer. Command Shift E on a Mac, Control Shift E on a PC, and then hit the save. That's Command S on a Mac, Control S on a PC. Once that's done, we can close this image, go back to Lightroom, and you can see there's the modified image complete with both tips of wings on this one. We've got a little bit of an obstruction there, which I might choose to remove. Let's go do with that remove tool, but I'm going to use that little sticking plaster one there. So that's just put that down over there. And that small distraction right on the edge of that frame has now gone, and that is the image completed. I'm wanting to create a very dramatic black and white image from this particular color image. I'm not a big fan of the mixed color temperatures going on inside of this particular image. Now you can see in the basic panel, we've got my A7C2 profile here, and we could just go up and click on the word black and white there. This will by default just give you the Adobe monochrome setting, but we are shortchanging ourselves if that's all we want to do. So let's just undo that, and we'll come over to the profile browser instead. Now you can see there's my Alpha 7C2 camera profile, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the black and white options. Now as I roll my mouse cursor over these thumbnails, we're going to see different black and white flavors, if you like, and as we come down, we're getting a lot more deeper skies as we roll down to 5 and finally 6. Now we can get some other flavors, but I'm thinking 6. We've got the old traditional color filters that we used to use in the old analog era as well, the blue, green, yellow, orange and red, but I'm thinking of that black and white 6, which is one of my favorites. I've also got a little bit of a star there, which means that I've made it a personal favorite. If you want to make another one a personal favorite like black and white 5, just click in the top right hand corner and this will also become a favorite. I'll just uncheck that because I tend to lean towards the black and white 6 color profile. Already it's hugely more dramatic than when we started, and certainly much better than just that black and white conversion using Adobe monochrome. Okay, so the first thing that I will often do in creating very dramatic black and whites is I actually ramp up the extra contrast, and might I even put in a little bit of clarity as well. Now the blacks are getting very dark in here because of the pre-dawn lighting, so I'll just ramp that shadows up as well. Now we've got a very dark sky here, but I'm also going to want to have a dark lead in, almost creating a bookend to the dark tone at the top of the sky. So we'll just come over to the masking here. Now I've already got 2 masks in here, which are part of my developed default, but what we're going to do is I want that to be much darker. So I'm going to ramp that down, just playing by eye. I'm not really looking at the numbers, a couple of stops there. Now already that's great. Probably want to go full screen on this, so I'm going to create a 16:9 crop. Okay, we can sort of fine tune where that placement is, and then just click on the crop to enter that. I'll just check that full screen to see how it's looking. I haven't done a huge much other than using my own developed defaults, doing the black and white 6, adding a little bit of contrast and clarity, and this could be a done image in just a minute. But what I'm also going to showcase here is if we've got some converging verticals here. Now the camera is actually on a tabletop tripod which is sitting on the ground, and because we're using an angle of view which is probably close to the so it's a little bit zoomed in, but we are using a wide angle zoom here. We're still getting those converging verticals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the transform panel and use this upright feature. Now we could try auto or full or do manual corrections. What I'll do is I'll go in for an auto correction, and I think that's a little bit too aggressive, so I'm just going to back up and go for full, try full. That's still a little bit aggressive, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come with the vertical slider and correct that manually. Now that grid overlay is giving me a good idea of when those verticals are actually straight. Now we are going to click on that constrain crop option to get rid of this white canvas area that's creeping into the bottom of the frame. So we'll do that. And of course that's going to be the best sort of outcome if you don't want the converging verticals. There's no right or wrong here. Okay, so your personal choice. Johan Zarco, the winner of the Australian MotoGP in 2023. I'm capturing him coming through the corner called Siberia. Now, if I just press the I key on the keyboard, just look at the information, you can see 1/250th of a second, f11 ISO 100. Now, the reason the shutter speed is much slower than my normal action settings is because I want this movement blur behind the rider coming through to give us a greater sense of movement. I've also increased the drama in this shot through the crop. If I just press the R key, you can see I've twisted the bounding box here. You'll also see that I'm cropping into the 16:9 aspect ratio. So I'll just press the R key again and then press the F key on the keyboard to go full screen. That's the reason I like cropping in the 16:9 is because I can absolutely fill your screens with this particular shot. So I'll just press the F key again to exit the full screen view there. Now, if I press the I key, I can see that there's no information. Press the I key again, and I can see the cropped pixel dimensions, 7,241 by 4,073. Okay, so this is quite a high resolution images. Very few social media platforms can support such high resolutions. Even my Flickr Pro account only supports just over 6K, 6,140 pixels, and that does allow users to click and zoom in to check maybe finer details or image sharpness, etc. But most social media platforms are well below this. Platforms such as Facebook supporting maximum pixel dimensions of 2048. Okay, so 3840 is really where I don't crop much tighter. And this leads into my next image. This one is actually the world champion, and it is very close to the 4K pixel dimensions, 3840. I'm sitting at 3844 at the moment. Now it will show a very good display on a 4K screen, but if you're looking at it on a Flickr Pro, it's not going to allow users the option to zoom in to check more details or check sharpness. So in some instances, you may want to increase the resolution. Let's just take a look at the crop of this one. You can see that I've cropped in very tightly. Now you'll see the pixel dimensions, and when I'm cropping quite tightly, I do keep an eye in that top left-hand corner. For instance, if I crop like this, then I'm coming under the 4K. I prefer not to crop that tightly, so I will just raise that bounding box until I've got a nice 4K pixel dimensions, and we'll need to go a little bit higher than that in order to get there. Now you can't get it absolutely accurate. Well, you could do, but it would take quite a long time to get exactly a 3840. I'm not really worried about that. Even if it's slightly larger, I will export at precise 3840 pixel dimensions. I just don't want to go below that pixel dimensions if I can help it. So we'll press the R key. If I do want to print very, very large, or I'm trying to output an image for maybe 8K TV screens, then there is an option inside of Lightroom, and that is to come up to the photo menu, come down to enhance, and then we can take a look at how we can grow the pixel dimensions. Now the enhance will allow you to denoise an image, or it will allow you to grow the resolution. So if I've got denoise checked, I'm going to need to uncheck that option in order to access the super resolution. Now this will double the pixel dimensions on the width and height, so we're going to get 4 times as many pixels. So if I click enhance, it'll take a few moments to actually do this. We will see the new pixel dimensions, and this will now support 8K screens or very, very large prints if I want to go there. So we're just waiting for it to finish. It usually takes about 30 seconds with a fast computer. Okay, so now it's done that. It's enhanced. super resolution, and we can see those new pixel dimensions there. Let's come back to the grid view, and I'll just put in both images selected, and then we'll go into the compare side by side, and we'll click to zoom in. I've got the locked, and I'm just going to click to zoom in to 100%, and you can see the new file is obviously going to be a lot larger than the old file. And generally the details stack up very, very well with this. We can fine tune that, but you can see this is still a very, very sharp image because it is an AI feature that does grow this file size. It's something that you don't often want to do very often, but it is an option for you should you want to do it. If you want to denoise and grow resolution, then you'd be using a program such as Topaz Photo A, which can do both. It can both grow the resolution and also denoise and do some AI sharpening as well.